Carl Jung never read the Bible the way most of us do. To him, the book of Genesis was not merely a religious origin story, it was a cryptic map of the human psyche, a timeless myth cloaked in allegory, a message from the unconscious disguised as scripture. And in his Red Book, Jung dared to peer into the original rupture, the garden, the fall, the serpent, and the impossible paradox of Adam and Eve. But what he saw wasn't just theology, it was terror. Because the Eden story, according to Jung, contains one of the most disturbing metaphysical crimes ever committed, not by humanity, but by God himself. And in decoding this myth, Jung was forced to confront the most unholy contradiction of all, that the creator of order also allowed chaos, and may have even caused it. He wouldn't just analyze the text, he would resurrect it from the unconscious, and what emerged from the depths of those sacred pages was not salvation, but psychological horror. And it all begins with the question Jung couldn't stop asking. Why did God put the tree there in the first place? In the pages of his Red Book appendix, notes that were often overshadowed by his more symbolic visions, Jung directly wrestles with the idea of moral responsibility in the Eden myth. And he does it not from the standpoint of dogma, but from the standpoint of individuation, depth psychology, and above all, moral paradox. You see, Jung wasn't satisfied with the idea that Adam and Eve simply disobeyed. To him, the situation was a divine setup, a rigged experiment, an existential test that no human or archetypal figure could pass without being condemned. He writes that if God truly didn't want humans to gain knowledge of good and evil, why place such a tree in their reach? Why inject temptation into paradise? And worse, why create a serpent that could speak? This, for Jung, was not a mystery to be ignored. It was the root of all psychological tension in Western consciousness, and perhaps its original trauma. He writes, God is love, but he is also terrible. The fall of man is a shadow that does not fall upon man, but from the divine itself. This wasn't blasphemy, it was psychoanalysis. Because for Jung, the God of the Old Testament, especially in the Genesis account, contained an unresolved shadow. And until humanity confronted it, we would remain split between obedience and rebellion, between piety and neurosis. Most readers see the serpent as a deceiver, a liar, a satanic entity that corrupted innocence. But Jung, ever the psychologist of myth, saw something far more nuanced. He viewed the serpent not as evil, but as the first symbol of individuation, the first call toward consciousness. The serpent does not lie, it offers knowledge, and that knowledge, of good and evil, is what births self-awareness. The horror, according to Jung, is that the path to maturity begins with disobedience, that to become truly human, one must break away from unconscious paradise. The snake is no longer the enemy, but the awakener, Jung notes. This reframing is psychologically radical, because it casts the Eden story not as a moral failure, but as a developmental necessity. Humanity could not remain in Eden, not because we were fallen, but because we were growing, and yet, God punishes this growth. Here, Jung inserts his most disturbing insight, that the original trauma was not sin, but repression, that God himself, in his rage, symbolized the father figure who could not tolerate independence, that Eden was the womb and the expulsion from it, the birth. The serpent, then, is the whisper of the unconscious calling the individual out of the collective, a symbol not of seduction, but of psychic evolution. The tree itself, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is, in Jung's eyes, a terrifying archetype, because it divides the world. It splits experience into binary. It demands judgment. Before eating from it, Adam and Eve were whole. They were unconscious, innocent, but also incomplete. After eating, they gain discernment. They gain awareness of opposites, but they also inherit shame and guilt and self-consciousness. Jung describes this as the moment of enantiodromia, the turning into the opposite, a central theme in his psychology. To know good is to know evil. You cannot have one without the other. And so, the moment of awakening is also the moment of suffering. There is no coming to consciousness without pain, Jung once wrote. The fall, therefore, is not a fall downward, but inward. It is the birth of shadow, the splitting of psyche, the awakening of the moral self. But Jung warns, if this duality is not integrated, it will haunt us. Religions that suppress the shadow create guilt. Cultures that deny evil become self-righteous. Individuals who disown their darkness become neurotic. The tragedy of Eden was not disobedience, it was the failure to understand paradox. In Jung's interpretation, Eve is not simply a temptress, she is the anima, the soul image, the symbol of Eros, the connective force that unites opposites. Her role in the myth is crucial. She does not simply give Adam the fruit, she invites him into consciousness, into choice, into relationship with otherness. Eve is the gateway into the human condition. This, Jung emphasizes, is why feminine energy, particularly in patriarchal religions, is so often feared, because it symbolizes the unconscious, the body, the irrational, and most dangerously, desire. But without Eve, there is no story, no rupture, no awakening, no self. Jung admired this feminine power, but he also recognized the danger of projecting the anima outward, of blaming women for internal tension. He believed that humanity's mythic fear of Eve is a reflection of our fear of the unconscious, of Eros, of being changed by relationship. And the serpent-Eve combination? That's the double helix of transformation, knowledge and connection. But what was the cost? The birth of moral suffering. After the fruit is eaten, the first thing Adam and Eve do is cover themselves. This act, often seen as shame, is, to Jung, the origin of self-reflection. It is not simply modesty. It is the horror of becoming separate. Suddenly they are aware of their bodies, their desires, their mortality. They are no longer part of nature. They are observers of it. And in this moment, Jung argues, morality is born. But morality comes with anxiety, with guilt, with the burden of decision. And so, from one bite of knowledge comes all the suffering of civilization, not because we are bad, but because we became aware. Jung describes this as the moment when the ego is formed, and it is also when the ego becomes terrified of its own limits. We begin to seek redemption, salvation, forgiveness. But the original wound was not sin, it was division. Now, perhaps Jung's most radical claim in this entire section of the Red Book is this, that God himself contains a shadow, that the Eden myth reveals not a perfect being, but a psychologically evolving deity, a God who struggles with his own creation, a father who cannot control his children, a divine principle that is both light and dark. He writes, "The God image must be purified, not denied, not destroyed, but redeemed." This is an inversion of traditional theology. Rather than humanity needing salvation from sin, Jung proposes that the God image within us must be transformed, that we must move from a tribal, wrathful God to a God of wholeness. And to do that, we must face Eden again. But this time, not with fear, but with awareness. We must eat the fruit willingly. We must face the serpent as a teacher. We must see Eve not as the fall, but as the first light. The deeper Jung explored the biblical narrative, the more he recognized that the fall was not merely a historical or religious event, it was a psychic pattern that repeated itself in every soul. Eden wasn't a place in time, but a metaphor for a primal state of unconscious unity, a womb of divine protection where conflict didn't exist because selfhood had not yet begun. But the serpent's whisper shattered that dream. It introduced a new tension, the terrible gift of awareness, and in this moment, God becomes something strange, not just the creator, but the exiler, not just the father, but the judge, not just the divine, but the shadow of it. Jung's psychological daring was not in his rejection of the sacred, but in his demand to bring it into consciousness. He saw in Genesis a kind of cosmic betrayal, not because Adam and Eve failed, but because their fall was inevitable, a divinely placed trapdoor that no creature with a soul could avoid. The horror wasn't that humanity sinned, it was that consciousness was punished. And from that wound, all neurotic guilt flows. The trauma of the fall etched itself not only into the structure of theology, but into the psyche of every individual. Jung traced this inheritance through centuries of spiritual suffering. the split between matter and spirit, the guilt of desire, the repression of instinct, the projection of shadow onto others, the hatred of the feminine, the veneration of obedience. These weren't just cultural phenomena, they were symptoms. They were echoes of the unresolved fracture in Eden. The knowledge of good and evil is unbearable because it makes us accountable. No longer part of the garden, we now see ourselves as separate from the divine, burdened with responsibility, unable to return. But here lies the paradox that haunted Jung. The God who expelled Adam and Eve was also the one who gave them the capacity to choose. Was it mercy, or was it punishment? Was the divine preparing us for a higher consciousness, or condemning us for desiring it? In Jung's formulation, the answer is yes to both. The dual nature of the divine, as both creative and destructive, is the only way to reconcile the madness of the myth. And until we can hold those opposites within us, until we can admit that the God image includes both shadow and light, we remain children of an unresolved psychic inheritance. The serpent lives in us not as evil, but as the origin of thinking. And Eve, vilified for so long, becomes the first carrier of transformation. She is the anima, the key to mystery, the forbidden gate through which the human soul must pass if it is ever to be reborn. This, for Jung, was the true terror of the myth, that everything sacred had a dark mirror, and until you face it, you are its prisoner. In his Red Book writings, Jung spoke not with the clean logic of science, but with the trembling vision of a man standing before something unspeakable. The Adam and Eve myth revealed not just theological error, but psychological blindness, the inability of a civilization to look at its own trauma without flinching. He saw the repression of instinct as a collective neurosis, born from a God image that feared its own unconscious. A father who casts out his children because he cannot bear to see them grow. A ruler who demands worship, but cannot tolerate independence. But even more disturbing than the divine wrath was what followed, the generational curse. The fall didn't stop with Adam and Eve. It bled into Cain and Abel, into Noah, into Abraham, and into every biblical generation that followed. What began as a single moment of forbidden knowledge became a legacy of suffering. And Jung, ever the detective of mythic cycles, saw this as a psychic chain reaction. The original split led to projection. Projection led to scapegoating. Scapegoating led to violence. And violence led to religion, not as a cure, but as a container. In truth, Jung didn't want to destroy religion. He wanted to rescue it. He believed the sacred stories had value, not because they were literal, but because they revealed the structures of the unconscious. Myths, dreams, and religious texts all point to the same thing, the soul trying to understand itself. The Eden story, then, was not just a tragedy, but a code, a map of psychic development. And at its center was a terrifying message that awakening comes with exile. There's no return to innocence once you've eaten the fruit, and Jung warned against trying. The attempt to restore purity leads only to repression. He saw this in the Church's obsession with sin, in the denial of sexuality, in the idealization of the good self. All of it, to Jung, was Eden nostalgia, a longing for unconsciousness disguised as morality. But he knew the way forward wasn't backward, it was through the serpent, through the shame, through the unbearable knowledge of opposites. This is where Jung's psychological myth-making turns almost alchemical. The story of Adam and Eve isn't meant to end in guilt, it's meant to evolve. The fall is the beginning of a process that, if properly lived, can lead to individuation, wholeness, and even the reintegration of the divine image. But only if we do what God could not, hold the opposites in tension. To Jung, the goal was not to reject the shadow, but to make it conscious, not to silence the serpent, but to understand its voice, not to fear Eve, but to walk with her, to honor her as the first soul to choose awakening. That choice shattered paradise, but it also opened the door to meaning, and meaning, Jung believed, is worth more than innocence. He once said, "I would rather be whole than good." And nowhere is this more evident than in his reflections on Eden. By the time he was writing the Red Book, Jung had already undergone his own fall, a psychological break that nearly destroyed him. And yet, It was in that very descent that he discovered his inner world. He lived his own version of the Eden myth, a collapse of the known, a confrontation with shadow, and a transformation that left him forever changed. In this way, the myth of Adam and Eve became a mirror, not just for humanity, but for Jung himself. He saw in it the pattern of every awakening, the trauma of birth, the terror of freedom, the ache of separation. And yet, also the possibility of redemption, not through obedience, but through understanding. To understand the myth is to reclaim it, to recognize that God too is evolving, that the divine image, like the human psyche, must confront its own darkness if it hopes to be whole. Jung's interpretation is terrifying because it demands something religion often avoids: self-responsibility. If God contains a shadow, then so do we. And if the serpent is a teacher, then knowledge is not our curse, it is our calling. This was the message buried in the garden. Not a moral lesson, a psychic map. And the horror wasn't in the serpent, or the fruit, or even the exile. The horror was in pretending it didn't happen. Jung's brilliance lay in his ability to speak the language of the soul without apologizing to reason. He knew that what we call myths are not primitive fictions, but psychic codes, distilled visions of what the human being experiences internally across generations. The Garden of Eden, for him, was not simply a religious myth, but a revelation of the fundamental division within human nature. And that division, between instinct and morality, between the divine and the personal, between what is and what should be, becomes a permanent wound in the soul. In his psychological lens, the serpent becomes more than a trickster. It is the herald of transformation. The creature we are taught to fear is, in fact, the messenger of evolution. Why? Because it dares to confront the stasis of paradise. It introduces change, danger, choice. The it speaks a truth that splits the world in two. Once you know, you cannot unknow. The symbolic act of eating the fruit becomes the spark of individuation, the awakening of the ego from the warm sleep of unconscious unity. Jung was adamant. Individuation begins with a fall, not with glory, but with confusion, with alienation. The loss of paradise is not punishment, but necessity, because no one becomes whole while asleep in Eden. In his reflections, Jung does not absolve God. He does not sanitize the divine. In fact, he complicates God, the same way he complicates the self. He speaks of the Yahweh of the Old Testament as a being filled with contradictions, creative yet destructive, loving yet wrathful, omnipotent yet jealous. Jung believed that this portrayal was not blasphemy, but psychological realism. The divine must contain opposites because we do, and any image of God that denies its own shadow becomes toxic. It breeds fanaticism, guilt, and repression. In the Adam and Eve myth, God does not warn like a father. He commands like a ruler. The prohibition against the tree of knowledge is not couched in reason, but in fear. You shall surely die, he says, not because of the fruit's danger, but because knowledge challenges authority. The moment Adam and Eve gain self-awareness, God declares, "Behold, the man is become as one of us." It is not sin that offends him, it is parody. Jung read this as a moment of existential terror, a deity who fears his own creation, and in that fear, he casts them out, not just from the garden, but from divine union itself. Humanity, from that point forward, walks a path of isolation, seeking a way back, but there is no return to Eden, only forward, through suffering, through complexity, through the integration of all that has been repressed. In Jung's Red Book, we see this theme play out in deeply symbolic visions. He meets figures like Elijah and Salome, who represent the prophetic masculine and the seductive feminine. He confronts serpents, demons, and gods. He walks through deserts of the psyche where identity dissolves. And time again he faces the same revelation, that true divinity must include the darkness, that light alone is not God, that what we call evil may in fact be the gatekeeper to wholeness. This is what makes his interpretation of Adam and Eve so disturbing. It forces us to admit that the very things we call sinful, desire, disobedience, doubt, are the forces that awaken us. They are not accidents. They are catalysts. And this is why Jung had no interest in idealizing innocence. He saw it as a trap, a refusal to grow. Innocence is no protection, he once said, against the forces of the unconscious. The refusal to confront our own shadow leads not to salvation, but to possession, where what we deny in ourselves returns with a vengeance, masked as fate or enemy or evil. The garden myth hides this warning. The more you repress, the more power the repressed gains. The more you reject the serpent, the more venom it stores in your dreams. The more you silence Eve, the more she rules your projections. Jung saw the repression of the feminine as one of the deepest wounds in Western consciousness. Eve, the bringer of knowledge, becomes the scapegoat. Woman becomes temptation. Instinct becomes sin. And in this split, the psyche fractures. No longer able to balance its energies, it demonizes what it cannot control. Thus, the anima, the inner feminine, becomes lost, and the man, lacking connection to his soul, becomes tyrant or slave. This wound, Jung believed, was not just historical, it was archetypal, and unless addressed, it doomed both men and women to cycles of domination, suppression, and alienation. The true horror of Eden was not that we fell, it's that we refused to learn why. Redemption, in Jung's view, is not about moral perfection, it's about wholeness, and wholeness demands that we reintegrate the serpent, that we revisit the garden, not to reclaim it, but to understand why we left. Only then can we move beyond the binary of good and evil and into a new psychological maturity, one that recognizes the divine not as a tyrant in the sky, but as the totality of being within. In one of his most striking Red Book reflections, Jung describes encountering God in the form of a dark figure, not radiating light, but concealed in shadow. The encounter horrifies him, but it also transforms him. He writes, "What you call the devil is nothing other than the deep interior of God. This is not heresy. It is a call to confront the full spectrum of the divine image, to look at the face behind the mask, to meet the God who exiled us, and understand that he, too, longs for reunion." For Jung, the story of Eden is not a tragedy to be reversed. It is an initiation to be honored. The horror is part of the sacred. The exile is part of the journey. The knowledge of good and evil is not our curse. It is our inheritance. And if we dare to confront it, to live it, to integrate it, then perhaps we can become what the myth always hinted at. Not creatures crawling back to a lost paradise, but beings who carry the garden within, transformed by the fall and destined not for return, but for something greater. Jung's reworking of the Adam and Eve story is not simply an intellectual exercise, it is a psychological key, one that unlocks how we relate to guilt, to love, to autonomy, to the very origins of our identity. The myth is not a relic of religious dogma, it is the encoded blueprint of a universal human trauma, the birth of self-awareness. To Jung, the most disturbing feature of the story is also its most familiar, the way humanity was never given a choice before it was condemned. Adam and Eve were not offered individuation, it was thrust upon them. They did not craft their fall, it was embedded in the structure of the cosmos. This is the horror, the realization that suffering is not accidental, it is archetypal, and that our deepest growth often emerges not from our choices, but from what is chosen for us. This is why Jung's reflections on Yahweh are so startling. He saw in the God of Genesis an image of unconscious power, creative, yes, but blind to itself. A God that punishes because it does not understand the implications of its own law. Jung does not declare this God evil, he declares it incomplete. And in this, he makes a radical suggestion that not only man must evolve, but God must evolve too. It is not that God is wrong, it is that God, as a symbol, is still becoming whole. This heretical-sounding view finds its grounding not in rebellion, but in integration. Jung believed that the modern mind must accept what religion had often split in two, that the divine and the demonic are not separate species, but reflections within the same mirror. This is the alchemical view. Opposites must be reconciled. Spirit must be made flesh. Heaven and hell are not destinations. They are internal processes of transformation. And this returns us to the serpent, If the serpent is knowledge, then knowledge is not neutral. It disrupts. It corrupts. But it also liberates. Eve does not destroy Eden. She initiates consciousness. She embodies the principle of Gnosis, forbidden insight. This is what makes her dangerous, not her sex, not her disobedience, but her capacity to awaken. In this reading, Eve is not the villain. She is the first fully conscious human being, the one who dares to question an unquestionable authority, the one who breaks the spell, the one who chooses evolution over obedience. This is what has terrified patriarchal structures for millennia: the empowered feminine, the untamed soul, the bearer of unapproved wisdom. Jung sensed this deeply. He wrote that modern people were still haunted by the fear of Eve, and that as long as she remained repressed, internally and culturally, we would continue to exile vital aspects of our psyche: the anima, the instinctual intelligence, the body, the earth, the intuitive knowing, all cast out of the garden of rational control. But repression breeds shadow, and so, the more we suppress the feminine principle, the more distorted it returns, as temptation, as hysteria, as shame, as projection. Jung's solution was not to glorify one pole over the other, but to reconcile them, to allow Eve to return to the center of the myth, not as corrupter, but as co-creator. This, perhaps, is the true horror and promise of the Adam and Eve story through Jung's eyes, that we are not innocent victims of a divine mistake. We are the continuation of a cosmic process, a process that demands sacrifice, division, and eventual reintegration. We were cast out not to be punished, but to be transformed, and that transformation is still happening, inside each of us. The garden, then, was never lost. It was reabsorbed into the psyche, buried beneath layers of repression, dogma, fear, and forgetting. The tree of knowledge was not destroyed. It became the nervous system. The myth lives on, as neurosis, as longing, as hunger for transcendence. And our task, Jung believed, was not to escape it, but to live it consciously, to eat the fruit again, but this time, with eyes open. In one final, haunting note from the Red Book, Jung writes, "He who goes to himself risks a confrontation with himself. The self is not something given, but something that must be achieved." This echoes the Edenic theme. Knowledge is not passive, it is earned, it is paid for, and the price is high: the loss of innocence, the burden of choice, the terror of freedom. But the reward is wholeness, and so, the myth of Adam and Eve is not just about a fall, it is about a return, not to the garden, but to a self that includes all opposites, a self that holds both the serpent and the angel, both God and shadow, both man and woman, both good and evil, not as moral binaries, but as essential energies in the alchemy of the soul. This is Carl Jung's darkest biblical case, not because it condemns us, but because it reveals what we are made of. We are the children of knowledge, the inheritors of exile, the seekers of integration. And perhaps one day we will realize that the gate back to Eden has always stood open, not behind us, but ahead, hidden in the horrors we dare to face, hidden in the serpent's gift, hidden in the story we thought we understood, but had only just begun to read.